Have you ever discovered a long-running series of games that appeals to you on seemingly every level, so you sit down and play some of the games, only for that to slowly reveal the fact that you don't actually like it as much as you once thought? Oddly specific, but that was my exact story with Gran Turismo. I thought I loved everything about it, until I played every entry up until GT5, including the one for the PSP. I was still able to recognize all of their qualities, but not even GT4, what is generally considered to be the best one, could keep me coming back. It's gotta be a combination of the car handling, economy, and game structure, not to mention the license tests that made playing these games the only part that I don't like, cause other than that, I still really do love the presentation, music, and overall concept of the series, not to mention the impact that it's had on the genre. Anyway, I came across this game called GT Pro Series, and the first thing I said when I looked up gameplay was, this is literally Gran Turismo, how did they get away with this? But not too long after, I realized that things weren't exactly as they seemed. It turns out that GT Pro Series is actually the final entry in the GT Advance series, a trilogy of GBA racing games that, despite the system's immense limitations and shaky track record for the genre, are actually pretty good. This video is going to focus on GT Pro Series in particular, but I do feel that it would be a disservice to completely ignore the early entries. I didn't spend too long with the GBA games, but my general impressions are highly positive. First of all, the games run smooth as butter with responsive controls and an impressive illusion of depth achieved by altering the palette on the road. The few truly 3D racing games on GBA may theoretically be more advanced, but when the 3D is simply a well-done illusion, the performance benefits go a long way. Also, the music is ridiculously good. The second entry focused more on rally for some reason, and while it's not as fun as the first or third games, it pretty much makes Colin McRae Rally 2.0 for GBA obsolete, for as cool as that game was too. In a world where you can now emulate the PS1 and maybe even PS2 Gran Turismos on your phone, not to mention the purpose-built PSP game, GT Advance doesn't have much value aside from the sheer feat of making a GBA racing game actually smooth and playable. The first console entry in the series, in fact, wasn't Pro Series, but GT Cube, which never left Japan. I guess Nintendo's sales department had predicted that the Wii would perform just a slight bit better in terms of sales, so Ubisoft figured they may as well get something out of developer MTO's work and localize GT Cube as GT Pro Series for the Western market as a Wii launch title. Obviously that prediction was correct, but despite the success of the system it was on, GT Pro Series remains the last game in the franchise, although its creators kept their doors open for almost another decade. Based on that last paragraph, it should be no surprise that the graphical fidelity can't compete with the likes of Gran Turismo HD Concept or Forza 2, but even when compared to racers on the previous generation, Pro Series looks a bit behind. I mean, Need for Speed Carbon came out the same year on the Wii as well. Fortunately, the car models still look quite good, and there's a certain cartoony appeal to the visuals which I feel helps immensely. It's no Mario Kart or Auto Modelista, but the shading on the cars is nice and I love the exaggerated skid mark effects. The menus have an unmistakable early Gran Turismo thing going on, and it's honestly surprising no one got in trouble considering this was before the big stylistic shift that happened with GT4. The sound design doesn't really leave much of an impression, although the sound that plays every time you pass an opponent is a welcome touch that adds to the arcade feel. Also, the music is literally Eurobeat. Back up a bit, did I just say arcade feel? Wasn't this supposed to be a Gran Turismo clone, a series that markets itself as the real driving simulator? Well, the driving characteristics are the first of many aspects in which GT Pro Series deviates from its inspiration. Okay, I think arcade isn't quite the right word, maybe simcade leaning slightly on the arcade side would be more accurate. Basically, most cars in this game are very light, and often it feels like power sliding is the fastest way to get around a corner, but no, there is no conventional drifting mechanic. That goes for even the optional drift handling style, which functions closer to Hot Pursuit 2's extreme driving mode. It doesn't completely change the handling so much as it makes your cars just a little more tail happy. While you don't have to pay attention to any racing lines quite as much as in Forza or Need for Speed Shift, for example, GT Pro Series physics will only forgive so much. You can't just throw your car into any section of the track, tap the brake, and expect to get by. And when you inevitably get overzealous and crash, you'll lose practically all of your speed. Speaking of crashing, just like in Gran Turismo, there's no damage being modeled to your car, but you know what? I think this fits way better here than in Gran Turismo. You'd think the ultimate driving simulator would offer a mechanic that's present in even some arcade racers, but aside from certain game modes and very specific cases, it's not really there. With GT Pro Series, on the other hand, the game's driving is so much more nimble and abstract that the lack of damage makes perfect sense. It would still be pretty cool to see, but its absence doesn't jump out quite as badly. Another distinctly arcade element to the racing is the head start system. It's common for pretty much any racing game to reward a carefully timed launch, but in Pro Series, things work like how they do in Mario Kart. Getting your revs in that sweet spot results in an instant burst of speed, which scores you like 4 places right off the bat. Just be ready for it so you can avoid ramming straight into the guy in front of you. I think my favorite thing about the driving as a whole would be how it makes even cars that you would expect to be a chore to drive actually fun to use. I understand that such a thing runs the risk of rendering the driving model as one-dimensional, but seeing as certain events force you to use lower level cars, I'm grateful that they aren't necessarily less fun than anything else. While I wouldn't call Gran Turismo an innovator in the driving department, it most certainly was in how you progress through a racing game. Instead of just a tournament and knockout mode like in most racers of the time, GT had a diverse series of championships with different requirements and conditions, not to mention the license tests. GT Pro Series takes some elements of this at the time progressive approach and trims it down in a really interesting way. Unlike Gran Turismo, where everything was technically available to you even if you really weren't able to access just any event, here progression is completely railroaded. You start in the beginner class, then complete a few license tests and move on to the intermediate class, rinse and repeat. That's not to say that there's zero player agency. You may have noticed that there's no credit counter anywhere on the screen. That's because GT Pro Series forgoes any sort of currency system. You start out with a handful of cars available and unlock more as you complete events. But if you could just pick the best cars early on, then what's the point in progressing? Well, much like Forza, the AI opponents match what you're driving, so if you decide that you want to drive something a bit faster right out the gate, you're going to have to compete against faster opponents. These still aren't too bad in the beginner class, but as the game goes on, you will truly have to get used to the higher performance of the faster cars if you wish to keep using them. Despite a mild increase in difficulty, I can't say that my opponents ever got hard enough for me to have to upgrade any of my cars. Just like everything else in this game, upgrades are free. As soon as you unlock them, they can be applied to any car, which kinda makes me wonder why they don't just become equipped automatically. Other than performance, you can also modify stuff like your car's color, headlights, and even the horn sound, but aside from that, it's easy to forget that tuning is even a feature here. You don't really see this next thing a lot, but unlike most racing games where early events have you completing 2 or 3 laps, in GT Pro Series, the first bundle of events only requires you to complete a single lap, with each tier adding more as you move on. This was kinda jarring at first, but when I accidentally lost all my progress since this game from 2006 doesn't have an autosave feature, god damn it, I actually came to appreciate this a lot because it meant that you got the tutorial races, so to speak, out of the way much faster, especially since I had the option to pick a faster car than what I initially started with. Fewer laps per race also means that you get to experience much more environmental variety in a shorter amount of time. The tracks in GT Pro Series fall within the same archetypes as its inspiration. All of the tracks are fictional, with some resembling a traditional racetrack, others being based on cities, mountain regions, and there's even a blank copy of Special Stage Route 5 and 11. You know, the really cool tracks set at night. There's really nothing specific to highlight here. The track layouts do a good enough job challenging your cornering abilities and provide enough room to accommodate 12 racers at once. The tracks set on mountain roads for some reason remind me of Race Driver Grid's Toge events. Reviews on release criticize the environments for being like something you'd see on the N64, and it's pretty funny looking back on such a critique, given that there's now hundreds of teams of developers dedicated to keeping the look of the 90s alive. I think the bright color palette and background details is more than enough to keep the tracks visually interesting, but I'll take any compromises if it means the game runs well. I think a great way to describe GT Pro Series is if someone played a bunch of Gran Turismo, decided to make their own game, and incorporated every single thing they saw, but only on a more surface level. The reason why Gran Turismo had the systems that it did was because it aimed to be a sort of vehicle-based role-playing experience. You bought your own cars, you earned licenses, you won races, upgraded your car, won more races, and then bought more cars. Here, you win cars, but you never have to upgrade them, and since progression is based entirely on just completing a checklist, there's no clever routing you can do or exploits of the economy or something like that. It's essentially a completely guided experience. The driving, while more befitting of my own tastes, is practically the same across every car in the game, making the inclusion of stuff like different drivetrains and engine placements redundant. With the lack of an economy, you never feel a sense of ownership of your cars because that grind to be able to buy one doesn't exist, making the customization options superfluous. There's also no used marketplace, eliminating that aspect of decision making when buying your next car. Finally, the license tests are so forgiving that you don't ever feel as if you've become a better driver upon completing them, which was the whole point. None of these design changes come across as mere oversights. They feel completely intentional, like the designers wanted to make the experience as hassle-free as possible for the Wii's more casual audience, which is hilarious considering that the Gran Turismo games are some of the highest selling on their respective platforms, so clearly they have much more than just a niche appeal. By all accounts, I should be in full agreement with GT Pro Series' bad review scores, but if you couldn't guess already, the things that make this game so shallow might just be why I've played it so much. Whenever I jump into a Gran Turismo game, in less than half an hour, I find myself overwhelmed with choices to make and things to complete. It's great that all of that content is there and structured the way that it is, but that's not always what I'm in the mood for. The only way I'm able to make progress is to force myself down a very linear completion path based on the game's license test requirements, but then I end up getting bored. GT Pro Series takes the stuff I like from GT and reformats them into an easy-to-digest, simple arcade racing experience that makes hours go by without notice. It's the kind of game that is proof of my theory that gaming truly is the most heavily subjective medium, even more than music. We can generally agree on what sounds good and bad, even with room for acquired taste, but for video games, things go so much deeper that right and wrong are almost impossible to pin down. Objectively, even Gran Turismo 1, released a decade prior, is a better game than GT Pro Series, but after completing both, I can't just pretend like I had more fun with the former, when I was honestly just pushing through most of it out of respect for the series. And no, the sequels didn't fare any better for me. Nothing can change the underlying choices that makes Gran Turismo what it is, and that's okay. Now I simply know where to get my GT fix in a non-GT game.